Well, good afternoon. Well, morning, everybody. I hope everyone can hear me. I'm going to type into the chat box that you should have sound. And if you do not, we'll know that there's a problem. So I wanted to thank everyone for coming today and taking time out of our busy COVID lives to talk about the importance of aligning your content and your assessments to your learning objectives. And I know that sometimes this can seem overwhelming or unimportant. And so we're just going to walk through some of, why it matters and give you some tools. And as we go on, there'll be a few there's an activity we're going to do together, and then there'll be a breakout. So people may pop in, but in respect for your time, we're going to get started. And so again, we're here to discuss aligning content and learning objectives to improve student learning success. So let me also put in, that's the link to the main shared folder in Google Docs. As we go through the program, I will also, if there's a direct link to something that might be easier to get to, I will put that as well as we go through. And these will be available to you after the program. You can download anything that's in there, and I have shared it all with you. My email is going to be listed at the end. I will provide it in chat as well. But should you have any troubles with that after the fact, please let me know, and I'll make sure you get everything that you need. Remain muted unless you're speaking to the group, as you probably have already experienced today. We get feedback or weird noises. So we'll just move along. Hopefully there will be no Zoom bombing, but if we do get Zoom bombed, these are just some quick little tips for how we'll handle this. You'll turn off your video if you have it on. You'll mute your microphone. If you're in the breakout room, which we're only going to do once, immediately return to the main room. And at that point, I will have already tried to get the person out, and I'll let you know if we can continue, but if not, we'll have to exit the session. So let's get started. And of course, evil raccoon, it's really not going to be that bad. That's to make you dread it a little more, and then hopefully you'll think this is great. So instructional alignment. We want to talk about objectives, activities, and assessment. It's the whole kit and caboodle there. So content, activities, and assessments, they're more than just drilling and testing, and they're more than just doing that so you can assign a grade. They should make up a system that provides feedback to the student about their learning, because that's going to help them be more successful. And I want you to consider an approach where we use Bloom's taxonomy to improve the student learning. We are going to use the revised Bloom's, and I'm not going to bore you with a whole bunch of nitty-gritty about where it came from and all of that. We will go over it though, in case you're either not familiar with it or need a little refresher. And so when we do that, we're going to use that taxonomy to improve that system that I just talked about through the alignment of the objectives, the activities, and the assessments, all with each other. So in order to do that, we need to be able to write observable learning objectives and choose formative content that supports those. And then choose the assessment that accurately assesses the content that we taught. And hopefully that's also the content that we told them that they were going to learn. So this ultimately leads us to content and assessments that are aligned to those objectives. And when activities and assessments are lined up with the ultimate objectives, you have what's called alignment. And you've probably heard that it's a big thing with Quality Matters, which is important, but it's also really important for student success. It helps them know from the start where they think they're going to go and what they're going to do. So we are going to do a poll, and this poll is an opportunity for you to tell me what you really think about learning objectives. And I can't see who chose what. I made it anonymous, so let's be honest. Even if it's, the answer is, I think they're dumb, that's okay. But I'm going to have to launch the poll. It might take me just a second, so let me get to that. And you should now be able to see them. Please let me know if no one is seeing it. And you can look these over, take a little time, pick the one you want. And y'all are really good. I think everybody has posted, and if not, I'm sure it'll come in. So just to give you an idea, and I'm going to ignore that. I just want to take a little picture of it so I'll have it so I don't forget it. So about 17% of you say you pull it directly from the textbook, and 67% of you say you use it to guide your course, which is amazing and awesome, and thank you for that. And I thank the person who is totally honest and said that they think it's pointless, that students don't read them or care about them. And one person said it's necessary evil. So that just kind of lets you know that, you know, everybody has a feeling about learning objectives. I always joke and say it's polarizing. You never know how someone's going to react when you bring up learning objectives. So thank you for participating in the poll. And you can see it right there real quick. That's exactly what I just told you. But the majority of you do feel like it can help you guide your class. And I can't get out of the polling. Hang on just a second. It'll let me end it probably in a second. You know what? I'm going to just hide it, I think. I don't know why it's I apologize, everyone. I know it's terrible when somebody keeps clicking and saying they don't know where something is or it got moved. Oh, I know exactly what I did. So there we go. So thank you again for that. So we're going to get a little deeper in. You know, I kind of touched on it, but course alignment, the objectives are really the expectations for student performance. So it's a connection between activities and assessment, and we want that to match up so that the students learn what you intend. And you can accurately assess what they've learned or what they can do. If the objectives are expectations about student performance, then we need to be able to verbalize to the student and to ourselves what we want that student to be able to do when they finish. You know, can they do standard precautions properly? Do they know how to interview a patient? I mean, these things are super important. It's, you know, if it's vague or unclear, the students will feel that. Even if they're not reading up the objectives, even if you write that objective and you put it out there, you can still verbalize it to them and talk to them. You know, you're gonna be able to do X. I'm gonna make you a better nurse. I'm gonna make you a better tech, whatever that may be. So if they're written in ways that clearly state what they're gonna learn, and again, like I said, you can also be verbalizing it later. And it's written in the student voice, then we've set a stage for them to be successful, because good objectives can be referred back to throughout activities or assessments to show them why it's important. Because, you know, there's often that, I'm never going to do this, or why are we doing this? And that's when you can say, well, it makes you a better healthcare provider because. And so if we can tie the objectives to the rest of the course, it also shows them the learning path. And I know that kind of gets us into metacognition, where we're wanting them to be able to think about how they learn, and that's a big project, and I get that, and we're not going to go deep into metacognition in this because I know you just attended something on that, but I want you to keep that in the back of your mind, that it's also going to support that metacognitive growth. So, and as students become more aware of their own learning and have that ability to control and monitor and regulate that learning, it really does feed into the metacognition. So the activities, those are the things, you know, that's the experiences that prepare them to be successful in their assessments that you're going to give them later. And I understand that we often grade on formative, and that's fine. No one thinks that that's inappropriate. It's just I want you to think of these as the building blocks. So if they're engaging in activities or content, even if it's the reading, you've picked appropriate targeted reading that helps them achieve that learning objective, then we're being successful. Because students do complain. I mean, and to be fair, sometimes they complain totally without reason, or, you know, their perception is different than ours. But we hear them say, nothing we taught in class was on the test, or I wasn't prepared for the test because it wasn't anything from lecture. It was all from the book or something like that. And so we want to give them not only the path, but it supports you and what you've done and what you assess on later. So, you know, activities that model the objective clearly, that inspires confidence. All you have to do it is one time. It inspires confidence in the student that we're engaging them properly and that the things that you give them will help them be successful. And I know that real life and talking about it are often very different, and that the student has to actually do the stuff and be prepared or they won't be successful. So I'm not at this point talking about that type of thing. I am saying we're giving them the tool. So if it's truly formative and aligned, again, tools. I keep talking about that, but they are getting tools that help them be much more successful on those higher stake summative items. And then assessments. You know, it all does come to that. Is this on the test? Will this be on the test? Are you going to test me on this? How much does this count? So, you know, as we know, the learning assessment, it's the system and the process by which you're collecting evidence about their learning or their knowledge or their skill. And so you have to observe or record or score them. You have to interpret what you're seeing. And, you know, a good system of assessment gives them feedback about their learning. It gives feedback to you if they're having trouble. Like if everybody's falling down on something, then you're getting that feedback. So you know, you maybe you aligned it really well, but we got to do something slightly different. And it supports your judgment about the grading. So think about it from that respect too. I mean, it absolutely supports what you've assigned. You've assigned a grade. It's not arbitrary. And so there's your argument. I told you what we were going to do. I told you how we were going to grade it. And this is why you got a C, or however that goes. So beyond giving you that solid argument, the aligned assessments can measure what we told the student that we were going to measure. And I know I keep bringing that up, but I think it's really important that the student gets a clear and consistent message, because sometimes we have to say things a bunch before it kind of sinks into folks. And it is going to improve their chances for success at the point. And y'all, please forgive my COVID hairdo. I know that it's long and doing weird things, so I apologize. But it improves their success because we've given them relevant content and the formative activities. And then so our measurement is based on those things. We're measuring what we taught. And I know that seems like you're so basic. You're like, yes, I mean, I've been an instructor for X number of years. I've been in nursing for a really long time. I know that. But sometimes it's easy for us to get off track. So that I just want to impress upon you that sometimes when we get those complaints that you didn't test me on what you taught me, maybe they're not seeing it, and you know, maybe something else happened. But let's think about alignment to try to avoid that going forward. And so I've been talking about this a lot. It is important because it keeps all of us on the right path. We're all going in the right direction. When everything is directly related and, you know, truly aligned with one another, it's easier to hit targets. And that's students can hit their targets of the grade they want, or the degree or the certification they need, and it's the target that you can hit of being effective and, you know, having a good pass rate and knowing that you're sending people out there who can do their jobs and do it well. And so if they're not aligned, I'm not saying these are hard and true, this isn't like a law of gravity, but if they're not aligned, your course can become fragmented or it could be ineffective. So, because the students might receive a mixed message about what they should learn. And if they're spending times on activities that don't lead to intended goals, then you're wasting their time and it's not helping you help them be successful. So the one thing that really might hurt your end as far as development, or if you want to tweak your course, if it's not aligned, you might have the problem of over or underestimating the effectiveness of the instruction. So if they're aligned and as a professional, you're like, here's my objective, and I've always done this content and this assessment, and you take a deep breath and you step back, you might be able to say, oh, you know what, that's better for chapter 9 because it's important that they know this, but maybe not here. And so it has to be reflective on your end. So having said all that, and I say this, we know alignment is important. Well, I hope we know alignment is important, but I also understand that everyone has their own thoughts on that. But it really does provide for success. But aligning a course, I mean, that's a lot harder than just talking about it, much like motivating students. We talk about motivating students, we talk about metacognition, but you know, in practice, these things are much harder than just talking about it. So I mentioned earlier Bloom's. So one way is to use a learning taxonomy. And beyond just it being this theoretical thing that somebody thought up and wrote a dissertation on a million years ago, it does have a purpose, and that purpose is to help you classify your objectives and then select those activities and assessments that align towards that. And there's a bunch, I don't say there's a bunch, but there's more than one. But Bloom's is the most common, and it was huge and it was big. And a while back, they came up with a revised Bloom's. And like I said earlier, we're not going to go through the history of Bloom's. We're not going to, you know, have a big educational theory class. But I want you to keep in mind that it really was designed to provide a classification system for thinking and learning. And it moves from the simple to the complex and concrete to the abstract. So, you know, it also has a path, just like we want to have a path. It goes from simple to harder, and, you know, really, this makes total sense to kind of what we used to call guiding questions, or, you know, things that maybe don't have a yes or no answer. So it also has a progression to it. And this is a quick recap of it. The wording in the pyramid is slightly different from the original, and it is using remembering, understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, creating. I know you can read. But that's, they thought that this revised version in the 90s kind of led to a more useful tool for planning. And so that's why I use this one. I like it because, one, it is a little more current, and it's just not as overwhelming. It makes a little more sense. It's a little shorter and just easier to handle. So learning objectives. I've talked about this a lot already, and we're only 20 minutes in. But they really guide our choices. So, you know, every program of instruction or your course or training activity, it doesn't have to be on the academic side. It begins with some sort of goal, and the goal can be broken down into specific goals or learning objectives, and those should be concise statements about, as I've said earlier, what we want the student to do. But that leads us to why it's important, and it is because it guides the student's path, but it guides, as educators, your choices moving forward. And if they're well defined and articulated well, that's important because we again have that clear path and we can direct the choice of your activities and your assessment strategies appropriately. And again, I always want, the big theory is important and all of that, but I also like you to know that it really does support you as an instructor as well. It's not just about the theory and the hoity-toityness of it. It's about, you know, you really saying, I nailed this, and I know I did. So learning goals and learning objectives, I didn't have this in until just this morning when I got to thinking, you know, there is a lot of confusion about a goal and an objective. I mean, yes, they're both something we want them to do, but a goal is more about what you want to accomplish in the course, is in the overall goal doesn't necessarily result in observable or measurable behavior. It's just so you know, that's kind of the goal is much bigger, and it can be much more overarching. That kind of deals more with pathways and what we'll do in COL. It deals with, you know, the big picture, whereas the objectives that you're going to write, those are brief and clear, and they're about what the student's going to do and be able to know or replicate when they complete this particular instruction, not when they're completely done with the course or not when they're completely done with their program. This is the small Lego brick and not the big castle that you build. So I just kind of want you to understand the difference between the goal and the objective, because sometimes I know if you've been through the revision process with us, if you don't pull your objectives from the book and you write your own, sometimes people say, that's a goal and we need to tweak that. So that's where that's coming from. So that's just a little bit of that. One thing that's really effective is for us to make sure that there's one measurable verb in the objective. This might mean you end up with more objectives than you're used to having, but, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, but I do need it to be one, I need it to be measurable. So we want them to be able to know that they have to define something or recall something or identify it. But things like understand or know, I mean, that's admirable that we want them to truly understand things. And understand is on the taxonomy, but that's because you want them to understand. That doesn't mean that you're going to use it in your objective. You will, within the understand level of cognitive process, find a measurable, definable verb. And so that brings us to the one verb, because more than one, it muddies the waters for them and you. Because a student can master the objective or they can fail to master the objective. And if the objective has two verbs, such as define and apply, how do you measure when they define it but they don't apply it? Are they demonstrating mastery, or, you know, is it partly? So a common one that we see a lot, and we've all done it, and it's so hard to break the habit, is compare and contrast. And we've all been asked to do it. I mean, I can't tell you how many times you get a compare and contrast. But again, how do you assess it if they only compare? Because they usually do miss the contrast part for some reason. That's not the part they get. So it's better if you could split that out. I know it seems verbose, but then that way you can easily say, you obviously know the similarities, but you're not getting the differences, so let's talk through that. And then, so this is one of those that I feel like sometimes is confusing. The course level objective, which is those 5 or so that you have that talk about the course as a whole. those verbs, that verb needs to be equal to the highest supporting lesson objective. Because if we can't verify that, for instance, if we can't verify that they can evaluate something, if our lessons only taught them to define something. So think about that. If every lesson they're defining or listing or describing, but your course level objective is different, you know, it falls into a different level, then that's where we're getting this misalignment. And that's hard, and we are not going to break it down into and do these really, really difficult ones. But we're going to talk through all of that, and I'm going to give you some tools that show you how to really tell, did it happen? Like, have I mapped it? And it is a map, and we'll talk about that. But strive to keep all of them clear, measurable, and concise. I mean, that was just a rehash of what we were talking about. And again, I want everyone to know that we understand that it's not as simple as saying, okay, I'm going to use apply and describe. Or, the most challenging part of it is also the most important, which is the observable and the measurable, because again, at learning and understanding their goals, but we can't measure that. It's kind of like a student will read X, Y, and Z. Well, how do you know they really read it? So that was something I used to run into a lot in K-12. We would have troubles with that part of it. You want them to understand it. You want them to review things. You want them to know how to review. Well, that's a little different. So you'd say they need to know how to do research. So break that down into the components that make the success for them. So that's how we get there. But we're going to have a little breakout, and which is a good time for me. I'm going to drink a little bit of water because I know I probably sound terrible. And I'm going to give you can go to the folder if you want, or I can send you a direct link to the document that I was going to use. And it takes me a second to do the breakout rooms, but I'm going to send you out into breakout. And what you will see, though, when you go into the document called Learning Objectives Before and After, you're going to see this page that simply says, look at the bottom. And if you'll see where I've put this little red box, there's group 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Each of these tabs has the same objective, so nobody's getting like a better one, I promise. All right, everybody. Thank you so much. So like I was telling everybody, it's not high stakes. If you didn't finish, don't worry about it. What I'm going to do is just pull one from each group and kind of look at it. And that way we won't spend an egregious amount of time on this activity. So group 1, describe and create a marketing plan for your organization. They nailed it. It's got 2 objectives, 2 verbs, and so they rewrote one to say define a marketing plan for your organization, and then a separate one to create a marketing plan for your organization. So very well done. Thank you, guys. Group 2, become familiar with the elements of editing. It's too vague and it's not measurable, so you nailed that. And then a good one is explain the elements of editing. And yes, I mean, that's really well done. You could say list, describe, all depending on the level that you want to measure at. So there's a million different ways you could go at that one. Group 3, complete the assignment. I love this one. Everybody always says, well, what does that even mean? You know, what assignment? What are we going to complete? And so wow, y'all did something massive. You said after teaching graphic quadratic functions, students should be able to complete all assignments in Math Lab pertaining to that specific section. So I understand where you're going with that because you were pulling from the complete. What I would recommend just is whatever the Math Lab assignments are in that section, break those down by what you're measuring. So, which is probably dealing with, you know, they'll be able to graph quadratic functions. They'll be able to assess them, or, you know, that kind of thing. So that's one way to look at that one. We'll just go back and look at another one. For 4, explain the benefits of various exercise modalities for an elderly person. And almost everybody does kind of catch on that explain is really wide for this particular expectation. This is also the one that I said, you know, I could see where some people might say, I don't really see what's wrong with it. So I get that. And, but some of the experts say that they feel like this is more something that you do, like you explain the benefits of the various modalities to the student, and it's so it makes this less student-centered. And so for student, maybe we would say that they could, you know, determine the best modality for an elderly person with X number of conditions or something like that. So well done there. And then so formulate a management for each of the above. And yes, that's correct. Formulate a management of what? This was obviously meant to be one in a series of objectives, but objectives should stand alone. So well done, everybody. Thank you very much. I'm going to get my hopefully you're seeing my slideshow again, because sometimes again I'll click on the wrong thing. So again, well done. I know we normally take a break after an activity, but we're going to do it a little bit later so that everybody can run to the potty and not miss any of my super exciting comments. So anyway, Bloom's Revised Taxonomy is a tool for defining the learning objectives, planning that instruction, and then aligning those assessments. And it combines the original levels of learning, which are across the top, which are, you know, from remember to create up there, with the types of learning that occur, which are listed on the left, and that's factual down to metacognitive. So you're like, well, that's a real pretty table, but how does it help me? And it actually will help you plot your course. So I've mentioned that aligned courses, you know, help everybody achieve the goals and all of that. But the table gives you the framework for kind of placing them in ways that you can visualize what's happening in your course. So it helps you approach your course systematically and effectively, and we're going to do it. It's going to focus your learning efforts on your learning objectives, and then it's going to help you select assessments that correspond to student learning. So when you do it, you might plot it, and then you're like, whoa, that's definitely not alignment. And so that's how it'll help. And because this table is kind of big, we're going to break it down, and we're going to go across the levels. So those bits across the top, as I was saying, those categories of levels of learning, they go from simple to complex. And so remember, you know, that's where they're going to recognize or recall something, you know, like a fact or a concept. A lot of times we use it for vocabulary. And then understand is more with constructing meaning from what we've taught them and what they remember, because they need to remember it before they can, you know, logically understand it. The next step is to apply it. So they're going to use all those ideas and concepts to solve a problem versus just knowing it, like they can regurgitate it back to you, or even in their minds they get it. But in this way, they've got to take it and they have to apply it to a problem. So then analyze, that's where they're actually going to need to break it down. You know, they need to split it into components, and hopefully they're going to see relationships across the overall structure of that information. Then we can evaluate. So they're going to make some sort of judgment call, you know, based on criteria and standards. So thinking back to the activity, kind of like that modality one, you know, they're going to think that would be a good one where if we rewrote it properly, we could say they're going to evaluate, you know, let's say evaluate an elderly patient's, you know, underlying conditions and recommend blah, blah, blah. So that's where it goes up another level. And then creation is the highest one that we get to. And that's where they actually reorganize the diverse elements to form a new pattern or structure. And that's not always something that we're seeking to do, because in some areas that's not what we do. But that is ultimately what create is about. And then as we work down the knowledge dimension, the types of knowledge, then those are categories. That ranges from the concrete to the abstract that I was talking about, but they don't necessarily range in complexity, whereas across the top, they obviously, it was a stair-step kind of approach, where this, they can learn a procedure or skill that doesn't require mastery and all the related facts and concepts. But they can still approach it, have a metacognitive component, because if they've reached that metacognitive way of thinking, they can assess how well they understand it. And so that could be done at any level. So don't want you to think that those necessarily have to go in lockstep. But to take that a little further, it does help to keep in mind that there's a relationship in the knowledge dimension. So with factual, it's kind of to the types that support, basic elements about a subject and what the knowing is. And so in that case, the student knows that. They know the meaning, they know something factual like a term or a vocabulary. In conceptual, what that means is they know principles and generalizations. So they can classify, they understand categories and theories, or a model or a structure of something. And then procedural dimension is more the how, so they should be able to perform a skill or a method, because the knowing how to know is going to be the next step. But the procedural is the how, like how do I do X? And then that metacognitive, that's more the how to know. That means that they're aware of their own learning, and again, they're in control, they're monitoring, and they're regulating. And it really can be done at any level. I just want you to know that kind of what the knowing component of each of those is. So these are, when you plot your course on the taxonomy table, it means finding where you want to place your objective, your activity, and your assessment so that they line up on the matrix. And this is a little animation. It does go kind of fast, and I'm more than happy to send all of this to anybody who wants it. But it kind of lets you know what they look like when they're aligned and when they're not. So that one's not aligned because you've got an assessment and activity, but an objective is way far out. And it's kind of the same thing here. You've got these objectives that are way down. Now, obviously, these ones with the big green alignment checks, everything's in the same box, and I'm going to talk about when that doesn't always happen. But this is one of those things, again, I keep bringing this up, and it's not to discourage you, but it's just to let you know that if you get into doing this and it seems so much harder than it should be, that's normal, but it gets easier every time you do it. And again, that's kind of your complex cognitive process of thinking. That's where you get to learn about that. And I did mention that sometimes I don't feel like everything ends up in the same little square. So if they're in the same cell, man, you pretty much know that that's aligned and you've knocked it out of the park. But we are going to talk about aligning objectives and activities and assessments where they might not always occupy the same cell, and when that's okay and when it's not. We're not going to do a deep dive in this, because especially if this is kind of new to you, I would like for you to shoot for same cell, just because it's safer for you. And then, of course, we can always talk about the deeper ones. But I will say that sometimes the activity kind of gets pushed off that cloud, because thinking of students and how they get new info and what they can do with it can kind of be hard. So it's 11:13. I do want you to take a little break just because I need to drink some more water, and that gives everybody a chance to step away and not feel like they're ditching out. And it's 11:14, so why don't we say 11:20-ish. I don't want it to be too long because then everybody gets bored and doesn't come back. So I will see you guys back in just a few. Okay, everybody, it is 11:20, and again, I respect your time, and I'm very, very appreciative that you're here today. So I will start up again, and we will hopefully finish maybe a few minutes early if you have questions, but if not, we'll finish right on time, I promise. So, and I guess I should never make promises because we never know what will happen. But anyway, this is just kind of an overview of what we're going to talk about next, which is, kind of, there's this natural association, like I mentioned earlier. Some of those cognitive processes do have a natural progression with the type, and they have this natural, alignment or agreement with the types of knowledge. So associations include things like the remember cognitive process and factual knowledge makes sense. The understand process and conceptual knowledge makes sense. And apply really makes sense with procedural, like we discussed, because in the, what do they know, the this, that, the knowing how, they should be able to do something. So if you're teaching in one of these dimensions, you should also assess its cognitive process. So there are other cognitive processes like analyze, evaluate, create that you see further up, and they're more general. So as far as applicable to these wider ranges. So if your students are learning factual knowledge, think about assessing that ability that they've remembered the knowledge, and if they're learning concepts, assess their understanding. And, metacognition is something that we're all talking about in the college, and I know you had a big piece on it today, but I wanted to just kind of remind you that, we know that's the awareness of our own thinking and learning. And because it's so important, we want to make sure that it involves the mental strategies we use to learn and solve problems. And so that knowledge is, since it's the self-knowledge of our mental strengths and weaknesses, how we learn best, how well we take tests, and what motivates us to learn, that the metacognitive knowledge is critical to this entire process. And so discussing learning strategies with students and making the learning more visible is beneficial and constructive and can go across the entire landscape there. So when we try to incorporate objective activities and assessments for the more complex parts, so those complex cognitive processes that I was discussing a little bit ago, analyzing, evaluating, creating, these processes facilitate retention of the other cognitive processes. So having a student evaluate a procedure, that facilitates their recall and understanding. So it does pull on those. So that's how that flow kind of works, and teaching them to analyze a fact or concept could have the same result. And this is another one of those quick little things. But to accomplish one objective, you may need to provide more than one activity. So, just remember that it's not a one and done. You can use the table to plot your activities and your assessments. And I mentioned earlier that alignment, when it's in the same cell, we know we nailed it. But sometimes activities can't line up that neatly. And that's kind of what I was talking about on the last slide, and that they've got to go through a series of things to get there. So, if your activity maybe plots low, but there are others that support it, that's okay. Or say your objective wants them to be able to discuss something. Well, discuss probably sounds right, but be able to list things. Don't feel like you can't have a discussion board where they talk about more than just what it is. I mean, there may be a way to help them kind of go a little beyond without you stretching it beyond true alignment. And that is something that I would recommend that first times you do it, if you're ever concerned, that you reach out to the Center for Teaching Excellence. And you will get this in your packet that I sent to you, but this is example of a persuasive writing concept, and I've broken it down. So because it on one page it was just way too overwhelming. So the idea here is that it's a persuasive writing of a historical issue. And so for the learning objective, which was that we wanted them to explain the effects of England's taxes on the colonies in a certain period of time, then students are asked to research facts and write a persuasive editorial article from either point of view. So if you break that down, we could plot the objective in the understand area of conceptual knowledge, because they need to understand the effect of England's taxes. But the objective, of course, we're not going to use understand. We're going to have them explain the effects of England's taxes on American colonists during that period. And so plotted objective is in the understand here. And then they've got activities where they have to remember that stuff and then maybe analyze it, evaluate it, and maybe create. I mean, it kind of depends on if you feel that a persuasive essay is a creation. So just these are the times where this is a different kind of plotting. So, but having spent an inordinate amount of time on objectives and content, I do want to talk to you about assessments, because there's no single type that provides a complete picture of student learning, but choosing the right type or the right combination can give you a really accurate measurement of how closely they're achieving those objectives. And so we're going to look at a couple different kinds, and just as we look at these, we're going to talk about when to choose them, when they might work best, what areas of the table that they're more commonly and effectively used in. And so we're going to look at objective tests that we're all familiar with, essays, and I'm going to talk about how an essay doesn't have to be a big old paper, concept maps, and projects and performances. So one more poll, guys, and then that'll be it for polls, I promise. But this one is actually where I want you to read it carefully and think about which assessment, based on the objective that I've given you, and then that supporting information that I've given you about the objective, would be most appropriate. And that's almost everybody. So I'm going to end the poll. I'm going to share the results for you, so hopefully you can see those. So the learning objective was apply cost estimating techniques to a construction project. So like maybe some of our engineering guys. And then apply should be supported by their use of a spreadsheet to estimate plumbing costs, is what would be in that activity that you tell them. And so which assessment would be the most appropriate? And I tend to agree with the group that we want them to calculate the plumbing costs for the project using Excel and provided data, because they're then applying what they've learned about cost estimating techniques. I understand where we might lean towards some of the others, and I'm not saying that those couldn't be supportive, informative in other areas building up to, but those might be more formative as opposed to a true assessment, because we're wanting to watch them apply. So I'm going to stop sharing those results. And I appreciate everybody involved in that. And then I'm sorry, that was just a little more information for the poll. So assessment types. And I know that most of us always, we know what formative and summative is. We're just going to do a quick recap on that. Where the formative, we're doing that before and during, such as pre-test or assignments along to determine where students are in relation to their learning goals, because that's going to provide them feedback that shows them and you how they're doing, and shows you where you might want to make adjustments. People just aren't getting it, so what do I need to do to kind of focus their efforts? And then summative is done more at the conclusion of instruction. And when I say that, I always want to make sure that I understand, that everybody knows that I understand that you don't necessarily just do this one big high stakes thing at the end. Maybe your summative is at the end of every module, end of every chapter. It's still at the conclusion of some bunch of instruction. So, it can be that final test, it can be a project, or it can be about that particular section. But just know that, that's to judge the quality of their skill and their knowledge. And it's providing the evidence that helps you judge their learning and then assign an appropriate grade. So we'll be offering an alternative assessment workshop later on in the semester, and I will kind of talk about, as I go through these, where those might play in. I know with COVID, it feels like a lot of times you're hearing something's coming later, or we're going to do it sometime, but we're not sure when. But I do want to let you know that that will be an offering at some point, that we'll be able to talk about things like performances and projects and what that means. So objective tests are the tried and true methods that we know. They can be formative, they can be summative, and they have what's known as selected response or constructed response. And so, this is the good, the bad, and the ugly. They're convenient, and they're generally easy to administer, logistics aside, if we're using Testing Center or something like that. But, they're easy to hand out, they're easy to score, and they allow you to focus on several specific things. And so, for example, if spelling is an objective because it's maybe midterm, or they need to know how to properly spell any sort of, like plant species or something like that, then an objective test can specifically target that objective better than an essay, maybe, because in the essay, the students we would want them to only choose words that they can spell correctly. We want to guide what they need to be able to spell. But the drawbacks are that they tend to, focus on simple cognitive processes like remembering and understanding sometimes, and it can compartmentalize learning and require students to perform out of context. And despite the name of it being an objective test, they can be subjective, not in that you can just randomly say, I'm going to give credit for B when it should have been C, but the creation is often deemed subjective and can be based on whoever wrote its perspective. But selected response, those are the things where we're giving them the answers and they're properly matching it up or picking the right one, like multiple choice, true, false, and matching. Constructed, is responses, fill in the blank, short answer, show your work, like in math. Those can all still be parts of objective tests. And they're typically used to assess remembering and understanding again, but if they're constructed properly, we can take them a little further and assess some more complex cognitive processes, such as applying, analyzing, and evaluating. Writing test questions that assess those more complex processes does take a lot of time, skill, and creativity. And so just recommend that for those that you make sure to make them what they really need to be. And that may mean you have to incorporate data tables, quotes, text charts. It could get pretty involved. So in order to get them to those higher levels, we want them to draw on things, interpret, have something to look at that helps provide a more complete picture of their learning. So these objective tests, when we, talked about how they really help and are effective and most frequently used, that's in remember and understand. And that blue shading behind the circle shows those areas. And if written correctly, though, as I mentioned, they can do those higher ones, as I did those in gray. But a tip for assessing procedural knowledge, and we'll talk about where that fits better later. Procedural knowledge, that's the ability to perform a skill. It can be used, but I put it down in the blue because it's, or in the gray, because it's really harder with pen and paper. You know, maybe it does work with math and it does work with spreadsheets, but those kinds of things. But just kind of keep that in mind, that sometimes that might be one of those areas where we step out of the comfort zone and go a little further out. So, you know, essays, they're going to allow students an ability to demonstrate what they understand. It allows them to apply, analyze, and all the way up to create. And these can vary in length. And so that's why I was saying earlier, you know, don't shut down the idea of an essay because you've got 5 sections with 30 students and you cannot read 150 essays that are 5 pages long with 1-inch margins, etc., etc. This really could be something from short paragraphs, maybe in the discussion board, or as part of incorporated into the objective tests. So there's ways to do that. So I just want you to know that it doesn't have to be that thing we always think of. And it can incorporate different styles with descriptive and informative or persuasive or an evaluation or some sort of critical type thinking. And these are nice because they're flexible, because you can tailor them to assess almost any sort of knowledge that you need or a process that you need to assess. And they can be combined, like I said, into the objective tests as a short answer questions, or it can be that massive multi-page manuscript if that's appropriate. But just want you to know, use an essay when you want students to be deeply engaged in the subject and apply something a little more complex, because they're going to need to be evaluating information, analyzing concepts, and then presenting them creatively and logically. Another thing about essays to keep in mind is that you need to be really clear about your expectations, and you know, recommend that you use a rubric. And you have to allow yourself plenty of time to score essays, because this also is about you and you taking care of you as well. I mean, don't underestimate the time you need to grade. It may not be appropriate. And so that might be why you would want to do a short answer or a involved discussion board. But, you know, just take care of yourself on that. But also know that if you do that, go down this route, that meaningful feedback is crucial, because it helps the students, you know, just be successful. Because if you're not providing that meaningful feedback as they progress, they're not going to learn what they've done wrong. And then you, like I said, you can incorporate those questions into the objective tests. So essays can be used in a wide variety, or used to assess a wide variety of cognitive and knowledge processes. And again, the blue is where they're really effective and more commonly used. Procedural is highlighted in gray because, again, I just think it's a lot harder. And I think there'll be other ways that you'll learn more effective than that. And then there are concept maps. And I mean, that's just what it sounds like. It's going to be a picture. So like essays, though, these could be used for learning or assessment. And some people call them graphic organizers or mind maps. But also don't think that it just means like those weird bubble maps that people use as a brainstorming or, you know, all about me kind of things. We can use it for very structured learning and assessment, because they visually represent concepts and relationships. And so they can vary in structure and purpose, because you can use them to show that the student understands the hierarchy of the structure, key concepts, you know, processes or decision trees. And so these can be used when students are providing you with a deeper show of their understanding of concepts and all of those. So if a student is developing a concept map, they have to specify the interrelationships between how those concepts work. And so this encourages, again, a more complex and critical thinking. It simulates a deeper understanding and some long-term memory of concepts. And it, but they're still having to identify, classify, and organize. So, it really does do a wide range. And I think these are a good choice for formative or summative assessments in any subject area, because you are getting a literal picture from the student of what they understand, that they can organize it or interpret a concept. And so that allows you to correct a misconception, perhaps in their learning. A tip here is to recognize that we don't all structure concepts the same way mentally. And so unless there's a specific organizational relationship the students need to know, obviously, the heart is never the lung. So I'm not saying that they can just rewrite information. But if there is something that allows for individual interpretation of a concept or relationship, in cases of, say, dealing with a customer, dealing with a patient, those kinds of things, this might be a good way to allow some flexibility and some personalized learning for the student. And so concept maps, like everything in our lives, they can be very, very directed, somewhat directed, or undirected. So there's the two halves, and then there's this mushy area in between. So, but the idea here is you want to use those directed ones when it is something like, anatomy, or a very strict procedure that keeps them from getting hurt, or they really need to do this math problem a certain way. That's when you use the very directed ones. And then you use an undirected one when they can maybe use their own creation and analysis and assessment to create something else. The good thing here is that I still recommend a rubric, but it could be a more simplified one. Or you could use kind of a checklist point system if it's a matter of, they had this thing and it went to the right thing. So that could be, and again, rubrics and checklists and grading, CTE is always happy to help. But because concept maps encourage some of that higher level thinking, especially in the undirected, they're up here near the top, and the directives are down near the 1 and the 2, the remember and understand. So what's really nice about that, again, is it's one type of assessment, but depending on how you structure it, it covers almost the entire table. And then projects and performances. Now, this is the one where I was saying, might be something you want to think about for an alternative. But before it seems overwhelming, think about the fact that, healthcare already does clinicals. That's technically a performance every day for those students. It's something they're doing in the real world. If you have a class where they have a lab, then that's a performance. Now we will talk about projects, but these are real world activities that help you determine what they know. And so, and today is STEM week, so I've focused on this, but if anybody who couldn't go on their week is here and they're not STEM, they're more than happy to reach out to me about other areas and projects and performances that might work. But for STEM, that could be creating designs and drawings, producing a scale model. I mean, that's a true project. Or even produce a structural evaluation report. That might seem like an essay, and certainly there are components of writing in that, but that is more about them giving you an end project where they've done all of this evaluation and created an item for you. Or lab experiments, like I was saying, if they're in the lab with you, they are doing some type of performance, even if it's formative, you're just building their abilities. So things about using projects or performances, I like to give you these little tips for each one. They're good for when you want students to cover a topic in depth and again engage in that authentic kind of real world task. Most projects and performances are challenging, and they require some initiative and planning and problem solving. And so this means that they can be tailored to assess, again, almost any of the items on the thing. But just keep feedback in mind. I know feedback is crucial regardless of what we're doing, but this is another one of those where I'm going to tell you that it is really important that you give them feedback to provide them focus. If it's a, if it's a lab, obviously, they're in there all the time and you're talking to them and looking at what they're doing and talking to them, and that's great feedback along and along. If it's some kind of semester-long project, or, at least to the mid, you're probably going to want some check-ins with students. And so this is a time-consuming process if it's a project or performance. So, that can guide some understanding to them that it's not just about this final product, it's also about the creation. You're there along the way, so it helps provide that belief that the whole process is what's important. And then grading. We always want to be clear no matter what we're grading, but again, expectations need to be clear. I recommend a full rubric. It would help you ensure validity and alignment, and it should reflect those observable goals from the learning objectives. And if it's a really valid checklist, like if they're doing a performance, like you want them to demonstrate X, checklist might be good, but if it's a big project kind of like structural model, then maybe a rubric. And so again, project and presentation assessments, they're unique and they are complex. And that means that they have the potential to really just kind of stretch wide and long across our table. And presentations are the only type of assessment that's spot on for assessing procedural knowledge. So just kind of keep that in mind. I really recommend it for that. And the good news is, this is my last slide except for contact information, which I put up for you at the end, but what you won't need because you'll get an email from me directly and I'll have all my information. But just kind of tell you what's happening, hopefully, as we all come out of, the interesting times we've had lately. Today was about the theory and some application, and about me showing you the tools that I'm going to give you to use. At some point, and right now we're not sure if it's going to be through CTE or through your department with your department chairs or deans, but at some point you're going to work together with your school or people who teach the very same thing you teach. I know that a lot of the schools have lots of very disparate type of academics that they focus on. So I don't want you to think you're going to be stuck with somebody who doesn't understand what you do. But the idea is that you will leave today with the tools that I give you, and I'm going to ask that you take at least one module or one lesson and you try to plot it, and you try to make sure you've got this objective, measurable learning objective. And so that would be kind of like your assignment. If I knew for sure we were all going to meet up together, but whether it's with me or with someone else, just take the tools and look at what you have and where you think it could go. And then later, again, and then a third step, and again, very well may just be within your group of like-minded folk. After you've done that and hopefully implemented it in the real classroom, the idea is that everybody can get back together and talk about what went well and what didn't for them. So, that way you really help each other even further. Like somebody will say, I did X and it just didn't take, and I don't know if it was just the group I had. I don't know if I'm not seeing something, and maybe somebody else with different eyes will look at it and say, I don't see anything wrong, but, I tried this and it worked really well. So that's kind of the three-step process for faculty enrichment that I just wanted to give you an overview of kind of what might be coming, and you will probably hear that directly from your schools and not from me. But I will send you all of the tools, and I will send you your activities that you did today, and a blank one so that you can show it to anybody that you might like. And again, my name is Tiffany Hofer. I'm an instructional designer in distance learning, which is within the Center for Teaching Excellence. And again, if anybody needs me, no need to write this down, because you'll get an email from me in a day or two with all the tools and some additional resources that are just there to be helpful for you. But that way we're a few minutes early, which is wonderful. So you can go off and live your Fridays like you would like. But I am happy to stick around if anybody has questions. I will answer those. You can unmute yourself and ask me anything you need to ask. Otherwise, you're free to go. And I hope everybody has a beautiful weekend.